next caller here. So next I want to get to Doug calling from Florida. Hey, Doug, how's it going?
Hey, everybody. How are you?
Doing all right, Doug. How about you?
I can't complain, none.
Cool.
I was running through some YouTube videos the other night, and I can't remember which one. But there was a guy who had a theory that the whole human sacrifice story, the whole myth, was brought up to stop people from killing children.
You're talking about the Abraham story in the Bible, the story of Abraham attempting to sacrifice his son, as a favor for God, and God kind of stopping it last minute. That story, right?
Yeah, and the Jesus story.
Okay.
Because I guess in that time of that era, around the Mediterranean, human sacrifices was quite prevalent. People would kill people to think it would make the sun rise, or bury kids in post holes to the buildings. That non-believers, people using logic, made up the whole story to stop people from continuing human sacrifice. And that makes me, I started thinking about it. That makes more sense to me than any of the other. Why would God create a son just to kill him? And when he can forgive sins, if he's all powerful and everything, why do you need a human sacrifice? So that was the ultimate. So now we can stop. Or the Isaac story. God didn't, stop his hand from killing his son. That it was all just made up myths that started to end human sacrifice. Have you ever heard that theory before?
That's interesting because I've heard there are so many interpretations about the Abraham story in particular. And I think, it's funny to me because you ask Christians what they think about it, but I always turn to the Jewish texts, and the Jewish kind of scholars on the issues, the rabbis, because it's it was their text first. So I want to see what they're like. And mainly the stuff I've heard is, your loyalty to God should be so devout that you're willing to kill your own family over it. That's one interpretation. Another one is God has a plan and that eventually everything is just in the end, so you just got to follow God and things will work out even if things seem kind of crazy at the time. Obviously there's probably some other symbolism in there too, relating to other kind of Jewish ideas. Of course, God provided, I believe it was a goat for him to sacrifice at the end instead. So there was still a requirement for sacrifice, but it wasn't the son. So that's kind of a metaphor for Jesus, right? That God kind of gave the sacrifice as for his son, for humanity, instead of us being punished. So that's kind of the Christian interpretation of that. So yeah, there's different ideas. I don't know the theological implications because I'm not someone who particularly believes in any kind of theology, but I know that scholars have probably talked about it in different ways. Have you heard any of this, Rebecca?
Not much, to be honest. I wasn't brought up Christian. I've never been a Christian. So I come to these stories completely fresh. And a story like that to me just sounds horrible. I'm sure it was intended. All of this, everything in religious text has a reason and a purpose for being there. Obviously, there were decisions made about what was put in there. And I'm sure they had, I'm sure there was an intention for it to be interpreted one way or the other at some point. But coming to it as someone who doesn't have any kind of, I've got no bias towards thinking God's a good guy. So when I read that story, he does not come across as a good guy. So why are you fucking with this dude?
That's interesting because, because that's just not interpret. Because growing up in the church, right, I was kind of inoculated to these different ideas first, so that I wouldn't think of that situation as kind of screwed up. And I think it's kind of screwed up, right? But I do kind of cringe when other people kind of look at it and say oh, this is just totally terrible, really awful, because I do agree there is a purpose to that text being there. And I don't, people who wrote that may not have also necessarily thought that was based on real events. Certainly a lot of in history they did, but there's a purpose in storytelling in the Bible. And I think if you approach it with that kind of, I guess, a more scholarly lens, a more theological lens, you can kind of, tear out the bits of it. Not saying, by the way, that ultimately justifies the story and the stuff that it puts out, because I do think people take that story and run wild with it and do all kinds of crazy things that they should not be doing. But that being said, there's a reason why it's there, whether it's for total authoritarian control or telling a story about devotion. You know, that's going to be up to the reader. Does that vibe with you, Doug?
Yeah, you know, I'm atheist. I'm firebrand atheist. I'm anti-theist. I was brought up in the church. My dad was a preacher. I've heard all this. I don't think any of it really much. Yeah, this legends are born, myths, stories. You're talking about people that walked around in nomadic for hundreds and thousands of years, that stared up at the stars and dreamed up stories and myths and legends grew. We certainly know the flood never happened. The Adam and creation, that's ridiculous. I don't know if they're Abraham and Isaac. But the more I listen, I don't know if Jesus ever was a real person, because if Christians had any evidence or any kind of, they would be running halftime commercials on the Super Bowl with them. If they had any concrete proof.
Well, they run billboards around these parts. I'll tell you that much.
Oh, yeah. I drive cross country and an over-the-road truck driver. I can't count the For Truth billboards I have seen.
Oh, yeah.
Forgive me for my sins. You can't turn on the radio, TV, billboard. It's everywhere. And it was all myths, legends, storytellers brought up, because none of it, when you really start looking at this, none of it makes sense. Not any of it. And the more we learn about science and technology, the more and more ridiculous it does sound.
You know, I agree with you, Doug, that if we're looking at these stories from a literal perspective, then, yeah, I don't think Abraham's story in particular, there's definitely not any evidence out there as far as stories like that. Now, New Testament stuff, people will quibble with you, but Old Testament stuff, you know, and there's arguments to be made that the original people who held these texts didn't necessarily think that a lot of these stories were literal. In fact, I mean, like, the Jewish tradition was to kind of argue over these texts. You know, like, that's what the Talmud is all about. I mean, we're talking about rabbis who are, who have different interpretations, and those interpretations change over years and years and years. So, like, even back then, if we're looking, hundreds of years back, there was not a complete consensus on what these stories really meant. And it's going to look especially foreign to us as modern readers. So, there's something to that to take account. But yeah, if someone were to come to me and say, yes, everything in the Bible is literally true, I'm definitely going to quibble with that, because I don't think so. I think there's some stuff in there that just doesn't really fly with what we know today. So,
yeah, we live on a flat Earth when we have a dome and we're riding on a turtle's back with elephants holding it. How much ridiculous stuff can you really make up?
Well, when you live in a pre-scientific age, I mean, you can get away with a lot, But now, thanks to peer review, we can kind of look at things a bit more critically, I think. So that's also something to consider.
The internet, these guys, you guys included, and your call screener, Michelle, is going to give her a shout out. She's a really nice person. But the things you guys do are really open. Aaron Robb, Matt Dillahunty, the Evidence Guide, that History of God that started talking about the Babylonian story, the Egyptians, the Greeks, and how it all blended together to make up the story of Yahweh. And I just say you guys are doing a good thing.
Well, thank you, Doug. I really appreciate that. And I'm going to keep doing my thing here for sure. And Matt and those guys will keep doing ours. And Rebecca is doing some good stuff too. So I got to give some shout outs to her. But I'll want to go ahead and move on to some other callers here, Doug, if you don't mind. But thanks again for calling in and kind of giving us your thoughts on that. Now, Rebecca, I didn't actually know that you didn't grow up Christian. That's kind of interesting.
It's not particularly interesting here. I actually just checked before I got on the call with you, and the latest survey, I can't remember who it was. The British Social Attitudes Survey in 2018 said 52% of people living in the UK say they have no religion. So we're actually in the majority here.
Really? Now, how recent is that information?
That's 2018.
That's 2018. Wow. Okay. So you've actually become more than half of the population. Now
that's people saying no religion, not
no
saying
religion.
atheist.
Now, obviously, that comes with the caveat of there are people who will say no religion, and that does not mean that they are one, skeptical, two, don't have some beliefs that might be questionable or that we might call religious.
Yeah.